The door of the Abbott ranch house had never opened like that before. Georgia Ellsworth stood in the cold October wind of 1883, her brown leather travel bag hanging from one hand and a letter clutched in the other, watching as two boys, one perhaps 11 years old and one perhaps 9, threw the heavy oak door wide open and planted themselves on either side of it like sentinels who had suddenly discovered a cause worth guarding. Their faces, usually arranged in the particular scowl that small, grieving boys manufacture to protect themselves from a world that keeps taking things from them, were different now. Something had shifted. Something cracked open behind their eyes that had not been open in a very long time. Behind them, filling the doorframe like a mountain that had decided to become a man, was Dexter Abbott, and his face told a story far more complicated and far more dangerous than any warm welcome. "You are not supposed to be here," he said. His voice came out low and controlled, the kind of voice that had learned to keep itself quiet so it would not shake. "The letter I sent said do not come. I was very clear." Georgia lifted her chin. Her dark hair was coming loose from its pins after 2 days on a stagecoach, and she had a smear of red dust on her cheek from the road, and she was more beautiful than the photograph had prepared him for, and he hated that. He hated that deeply, because it complicated the thing he needed to do, which was send her away before any of this went further. "Your letter arrived after I had already departed," Georgia said. "I did not receive it in time." "And even if I had, even if you had," Dexter interrupted, "you still would have come. Is that what you were going to say?" She did not answer that. She did not need to. He looked at his boys. Caleb, the older one, had his hand pressed flat against the open door like he was holding a dam closed. Little Miles had his shoulder pressed to the other side of it, and his boots were dug into the porch planks as if someone might try to close it, and he intended to prevent that with his entire small body. They were holding the door open for her. His boys, who had met every other visitor to this house in the past 2 years with cold silence and turned backs, were holding the door open for a woman they had never laid eyes on before this moment. Dexter Abbott felt something move in his chest that he had thought was dead. That was the most terrifying thing that had happened to him in a very long time, and he had survived things that should have killed a man twice over. "Come inside," Caleb said. He said it to Georgia, not to his father. He said it directly to her, and his voice came out strangely gentle for a boy who had not been gentle with anyone since his mother's funeral. "Yeah," Miles said. "Come inside. It is cold." Georgia looked at Dexter. Dexter looked back at her. The whole situation was a trap of a particularly cruel kind, the kind that traps you not with chains, but with something you had convinced yourself you no longer wanted. She stepped through the door. Both boys closed it behind her. And everything that was supposed to be over began instead. To understand how Georgia Ellsworth came to be standing in a dead woman's house in the Texas Panhandle in the autumn of 1883, you have to go back to the spring, to a small town in Virginia called Cartwright's Mill, and to a woman sitting alone at a kitchen table after her father's funeral with exactly $14.30 and a box of her late mother's good china, and nothing else that was properly hers in this world. Georgia had been 26 years old when her father died, and she had spent the previous 12 years keeping his house and nursing him through the long decline of a man who had never recovered from losing his wife or from losing the war. She had not complained. She was not built for complaint. She was built for endurance, which is a different and lonelier thing. And she had endured with such quiet competence that most people in Cartwright's Mill had simply forgotten to notice her, the way you forget to notice a wall that has always been there holding the roof up. After the funeral, her father's brother, a man named Howard Ellsworth who smelled of tobacco and bad intentions, came to inform her that the house had debts against it and would be sold to cover them, and that he was very sorry, but family was family and business was business, and these two things did not always align. Georgia had thanked him politely and packed her things and walked to the post office, where she had seen, for the first time, a small handwritten card pinned among other small handwritten cards advertising things for sale and things needed and things found. This one said, "Widower in the Texas Panhandle seeks a steady, sensible woman to help with a household and 2 boys aged 9 and 11. Not a romantic arrangement. Practical. Respond if serious." It was the words "not a romantic arrangement" that made her respond. After 12 years of quiet endurance, romance seemed like a luxury she could not afford the disappointment of. Practical she could do. Steady and sensible she had been all her life. 2 boys she could manage. And Texas was as far from Cartwright's mill and her Uncle Howard's condescending pity as she could get on $14.30. She had written a letter. She had received a letter back. She had written again. And then a third exchange, in which something strange had happened. The letters had stopped being the careful back and forth of 2 people negotiating a business arrangement, and had started being the letters of 2 people who were actually talking to each other. Dexter Abbott had mentioned his late wife, Margaret, almost by accident. The way you mention something that is always present but that you have learned to work around, like a rock in the middle of a road. Georgia had written back with something honest about her father, and Grief had recognized grief across the distance between Virginia and Texas, and the letters after that had an entirely different quality. It was the 4th letter that changed everything. Dexter had written something that was not practical at all. He had written, "I find myself reading your letters more than once. I don't know what to do with that." Georgia had held that letter for 3 days before she understood what she was feeling. Then she had written back, "I read them more than once too." 2 weeks later she had received his letter saying, "Do not come. Everything has changed. I have made a mistake in pursuing this. I am sorry." And 2 days after that, she had stepped onto the stagecoach heading west, because her trunk was already loaded and her ticket already purchased and her $14 already spent. But more than that, because something in her recognized that a man who writes, "I find myself reading your letters more than once," and then runs from it is not a man who does not care. He is a man who is frightened, which is a different thing entirely. And Georgia Ellsworth had spent 12 years managing things that frightened other people. The inside of the Abbott Ranch house was large and spare, and had the particular tidiness of a place kept clean by someone who needed order because everything else was out of control. The furniture was solid and plain: a good table, 6 good chairs, a settee covered in faded blue fabric near the stone fireplace. There was a bookshelf with more books than Georgia had expected, including a complete set of Shakespeare and 3 volumes of Dickens, and what appeared to be a well-worn copy of Moby Dick. The kitchen was off to the right and was immaculately organized. Everything was in its place. Everything had a function. There was not a single purely decorative object in the room, except for one framed embroidery piece above the fireplace that said, "Home is where the heart is," stitched in green and gold, and she knew without asking that Margaret had made it. The boys were watching her look around the room. She turned to face them. "I am Georgia," she said. "I believe you already know that from the letters, but I thought I should say it out loud." "I am Caleb," said the older one. He had his father's dark eyes and a serious, watchful face. "He is Miles." He indicated his younger brother with a nod of his head. Miles had a gap where a front tooth had recently been and hair that refused to lie flat and an expression that was working very hard to be cool and detached and failing completely. "Are you going to be our new mother?" he asked. "Miles," Caleb said, with the particular exhaustion of an older sibling. "That is a fair question," Georgia said. She looked at Dexter, who was standing with his arms crossed at the edge of the room, watching all of this with the expression of a man watching something he has no idea how to stop. "I am not sure yet what I am going to be. I think that depends on several conversations that have not happened yet." Dexter uncrossed his arms. He pushed a hand through his dark hair, which was shot through with a thread of silver at the temples, and he looked at her with eyes that were complicated and tired, and something else she could not name yet. He was 32 years old, and he moved like a man who had worked hard all his life and expected to keep working hard until he stopped being alive, and there was a scar along his jaw from something she did not yet know about, and he was looking at her with an intensity that he was very clearly trying to disguise as practicality. "You must be hungry," he said, "and tired. The stagecoach from Amarillo is not a comfortable ride." "It is not," she agreed. "I will show you your room." "We can talk in the morning when we can talk now," Georgia said, not unkindly but clearly. Caleb made a small sound that might have been approval. Miles looked between the two adults with the alert interest of a boy watching a very compelling card game. Dexter Abbott looked at Georgia Ellsworth for a long moment. Then he said to his boys, "Go on upstairs and wash up for supper. We will eat in an hour." The boys went, though not without looking back and not without Miles giving Georgia a small wave that she returned. When they were alone, the room felt different, smaller and larger at the same time. The fire was going in the stone fireplace, and it threw warm light across the floor, and Georgia set her travel bag down and did not sit, because sitting felt like it would put her at a disadvantage, and she wanted to have this conversation on equal footing. "Why did you write that letter?" she asked. "The one telling me not to come." Dexter moved to the fireplace and put his hand on the mantel, looking into the flames for a moment before he turned back to her. "Because I realized I had gone further than I intended. With the letters, I had said things I should not have said, and it would not be fair to bring you out here under false pretenses." "What false pretenses?" "That this might be more than a practical arrangement. I am not able to offer more than that. I want to be honest with you about that." Georgia studied him. "And what makes you so certain you are not able to?" "Margaret died 14 months ago," he said. "My boys are still not right. This ranch is barely holding together. I am barely holding together if you want the truth, which I suspect you do. I don't have anything left to give." "You wrote me letters for 6 weeks," Georgia said. "Real ones, not practical ones. That was a mistake." "Was it?" She tilted her head slightly. "You said you read them more than once." The fire popped. Outside, the October wind was picking up, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the windows the cattle were settling. Dexter was looking at her the way a man looks at something that is simultaneously everything he wants and everything he is afraid of, and Georgia recognized that look, because she had been looking at him the same way since she got off the stagecoach. "Georgia," he said, and her name in his mouth was a whole different thing than she had imagined it would be, lower and rougher and somehow more careful. "I will be honest. When you walked up that path, I thought what I was going to do was be very firm and very kind and put you back on the next stagecoach to Amarillo." "And then Caleb and Miles opened that door." She waited. "They have not done that," he said. "They have not opened that door for a single person since their mother died. Reverend Holly's, my brother Jim when he came out from Lubbock, the school teacher, Miss Pratt, even my foreman Tom Reardon, who they have known their whole lives and who is very nearly a part of this family. Nobody. They have been shutting the world out. I thought they were going to do it forever. And then you walked up and they held it open." Georgia felt something move in her own chest. "Children know things," she said softly. "They do," Dexter agreed. He looked down at his hand on the mantel. "I don't know what to do with that either." "Maybe," Georgia said, "you do not have to know right now. Maybe right now you just let me stay through winter and we see what it is that we are actually doing here." He looked up at her. "That is not particularly practical." "No," she said, "it is not. But I think we have already established that I did not come 600 miles for practical." For the first time since she had arrived, something changed in his face. It was not quite a smile. It was something that happened around his eyes, a loosening of the guard he kept there, and it lasted only a moment before the guard went back up, but she saw it and she filed it away in the place she kept things that mattered. "There is a room at the top of the stairs," he said finally. "The boys helped me put fresh sheets on the bed this morning. They knew you were coming even though I told them you were not." "How did they know?" "Because they are not fooled by me anymore," he said. "And apparently have not been for some time." That first week was a careful, watchful thing, like two animals circling each other to establish whether the other was safe. Georgia rose before dawn and discovered that Dexter was always already up before her, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the accounts ledger for the ranch, his face made of hard concentration. She made breakfast. He said thank you. She helped Miles with his reading lessons before the school term resumed after harvest. Caleb showed her, with the solemn gravity of a boy who takes all things seriously, which horse in the barn was the gentlest, and where the fence line of the property ran, and where the winter supplies were kept. He showed her all of this with the same quiet deliberateness with which he had held that door open with intention, without fanfare. On the third day, something happened that clarified things considerably. Georgia was in the yard hanging washing when she heard the sound of horses on the road. 3 riders came through the gate of the property, and they were not the kind of men who looked like they were there for a friendly visit. The one at the front was broad-shouldered with a flat, pale face and small eyes, and he wore a Colt revolver on each hip, which in 1883 Texas was a very specific kind of statement. Georgia stood her ground because running would have been useless and undignified, and waited. "We are looking for Abbott," the man said. "He is in the north pasture," Georgia said. "May I ask who is calling?" "Harlan Briggs," the man said. He said it the way men say a name they expect to see cause a reaction. "He owes my employer a debt that is past due." Georgia had never heard the name Harlan Briggs, but she absorbed the information and filed it and kept her face pleasant. "I will let him know you came by," she said. "And who is your employer?" Briggs smiled, and it was not a nice smile. "Tell him it is Burke Calloway, and tell him the patience is running out." They rode away. Georgia went to find Tom Reardon, the foreman, a lean, weathered man in his 40s with a careful face, and asked him to ride out and tell Dexter what had happened without alarming the boys. Tom looked at her for a moment with what she would later recognize as assessment, and then he nodded and went. Dexter came back from the north pasture faster than he needed to, riding hard, and he found Georgia in the kitchen making supper and asked her, with that controlled voice, what exactly the men had said and what exactly she had said back, and when she told him he was quiet for a long time. "You should know about this," he said finally. "It is part of why I told you not to come. Burke Calloway owns land to the west of here, and he wants this land, and he has been claiming for 2 years that my father borrowed money from him before he died, and that I inherited that debt. The note he has may or may not be legitimate. My attorney in Amarillo thinks it is forged, but we cannot prove it yet. How much is the claimed debt?" $800. Georgia breathed through that. $800 in 1883 was not a small thing, and if it is not resolved, he will take the ranch to a judge and try to attach it. Whether the judge is in his pocket or not, Dexter stopped. "In this territory, judges can be difficult. Calloway has influence." "Then we need to find the proof that the note is forged," Georgia said, "the same way she might say then we need to put up more preserves before November. Matter of fact, already planning." He looked at her with that complicated expression. "We," he said. "Yes," Georgia said, "we." She went back to stirring the pot on the stove. After a moment she heard him pull out a chair and sit down at the table, and she heard the particular sound of a man finally sitting down after a very long time of standing up and holding everything alone. "My father did borrow money from people," Dexter said. His voice was different now, quieter. "He was not always careful. After my mother died, he made some decisions that were not wise. I spent the first 3 years after I took over this ranch paying off real debts, legitimate ones. By the time I married Margaret and we started building something here, I thought it was behind us. And then Margaret died and Calloway appeared with this note, and I thought—" "You thought it was too much at once," Georgia said. "Yes, it is too much at once," she agreed. "But that does not mean it is insurmountable." She put bowls on the table and called the boys for supper, and the 4 of them sat down together for the first time. And it was strange and careful, and also, in some small and genuine way, good. Miles talked about a jackrabbit he had seen near the barn. Caleb asked Georgia about Virginia, and whether she had ever seen the ocean, and she told him about the time her family had gone to the coast when she was 8, and his eyes went wide with a wanting that she recognized as the particular hunger of a child who has not been many places and who intends to go many places someday. Dexter mostly listened, but he listened the way he apparently read her letters with full attention, more than once. After the boys were in bed, Georgia sat at the table with the accounts ledger that Dexter had left open and read through it carefully. She was good with numbers. Her father had been a school teacher, and she had helped him with the school accounts for years. She went through the ledger with a clear pencil and made notes on a separate piece of paper, and when Dexter came back from checking on the horses, she had a list of things. "Your cattle income is sufficient to sustain the operation," she said, "but there are 3 suppliers you are paying more than necessary. If you renegotiate with the feed supplier in Canyon City, they have competition now. There is a new merchant there. Tom mentioned it. You can reduce that cost by perhaps a quarter. And your accounts receivable from the Harmon cattle purchase in August has not been collected. That is $140 outstanding." Dexter stood in the doorway of the kitchen looking at her. "How long have you been doing this?" "About an hour." "I mean," he stopped. "Do you have a head for business?" "I have a head for not running out of money," Georgia said, "which is a necessary skill when you have been keeping a household on a schoolteacher's salary for 12 years. He came and sat across from her, and she pushed the notes toward him. He read through them. She watched his face as he did. His face was doing the thing again where the guard loosened slightly and she could see through to something underneath it, something thoughtful and genuine, something that was actually engaged and actually present, which was different from the careful, controlled surface he usually presented. "The Harmon payment," he said. "Ned Harmon he has been going through some difficulty of his own. I did not want to press him." "A payment schedule," Georgia suggested. $20 a month. That is manageable for him and keeps the relationship good. That is," he looked at the notes again. "Yes, that is the right approach." "And about the Callaway debt," she said. "You need to write to your attorney tomorrow and ask specifically for a handwriting expert. If the note is forged, a handwriting expert looking at your father's known signatures against the signature on the note could make the case. They have been using them in court since the 1860s. Dexter looked at her steadily. "Where did you learn that?" "My father subscribed to a legal journal," Georgia said. "He found the law very interesting, though he never practiced it. I read everything in the house." Something shifted completely in his expression then. It was not just the guard loosening, it was something opening, the way a room opens when you push a window up and let the air through. He looked at her with an undisguised, uncomplicated directness that was somehow more intimate than anything else that had passed between them. "Georgia," he said, "yes, I owe you an apology for the letter telling you not to come." She had not expected him to say that yet. "You were being honest," she said. "I was being a coward," he said. "And I dressed it up as honesty, which is something I apparently do when I am frightened of something." "What were you frightened of?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire had burned low and the kitchen was warm and dim and very quiet. "That it would matter," he said finally. "That you would matter, that I would let something matter again and then lose it." Georgia felt the weight of those words settle. She thought about 12 years of endurance. She thought about a letter she had read more than once. She thought about 2 boys holding a door open. "I understand that," she said. "I have spent a long time not letting things matter because the loss was too much. But I think I have decided that not letting things matter is its own kind of loss, and I am tired of that particular kind." They sat in the quiet kitchen for a while longer than was strictly necessary, and it was not an uncomfortable silence at all. The following weeks brought the first frost and the beginning of real winter work on the ranch, and Georgia discovered that she was capable of things she had not known she was capable of. She could not rope or ride, not properly, but she learned quickly. Tom Reardon, who had assessed her in that first moment by the well and apparently decided she was worth teaching, began showing her the basic operations of the ranch with the patient, methodical approach of a man who respected competence wherever he found it. She helped with the cattle count. She organized the winter supplies with a precision that made Dexter, when he saw it, stand in the storeroom doorway for a moment in simple admiration. Caleb began talking to her more freely. He was a boy who kept his real thoughts carefully stored behind a formal exterior, and he let them out only in careful portions, as if testing whether they were safe to release. He told her, one afternoon while they were gathering firewood, that he had been very angry at his mother for dying, which he knew was not fair, but he could not seem to stop. "That is not unusual," Georgia said. "Grief does that. It looks for somewhere to put itself, and sometimes it looks like anger." "Were you angry at your mother?" he asked. "I was 14 when she died," Georgia said. "And yes, I was very angry at everything, at the world for continuing to exist when she was gone." Caleb thought about this. "Does it stop?" "It changes," Georgia said carefully. "It does not stop exactly, but it becomes something you carry differently, less like a weight that is crushing you and more like something you have learned to hold." He was quiet for a while, stacking wood. Then he said, "I am glad you came." She felt that in her throat. "I am glad too," she said. Miles, for his part, had decided from approximately the second day that Georgia was an excellent addition to the household and treated her with the easy affection of a child who has not yet built the walls that older people build. He showed her his collection of rocks. He had 63, sorted by type and color, and taught her his system for telling the weather by the behavior of the cattle, which he had invented himself and which was, she had to admit, surprisingly accurate. And Dexter. Dexter was a complicated, careful, ongoing discovery. She learned that he had grown up on this land, that his father had built the original house, and Dexter had added to it after he married Margaret. She learned that he had a brother, Jim, in Lubbock, with whom his relationship was warm but complicated by their father's debts. She learned that he had a habit, late at night when he thought the house was asleep, of sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and sometimes just staring at nothing, working through whatever it was that he worked through in the quiet dark. She knew about this habit because she was often also awake, and twice she came downstairs and found him there, and both times he looked up at her not with surprise but with something like relief, and they sat together in the quiet and talked about things that had nothing to do with the ranch or the debt or any of the practical matters, books they had read, places they had imagined, things they believed about the world. The third time this happened, he asked her something she had not expected. "Did you ever want to marry?" He said, "Before this, before the advertisement, there was someone," she said. She had not planned to tell this story, but the quiet, dark kitchen seemed to call for honesty. "A man named William Pryor who I thought for 2 years I would marry. He was a good man. But when my father became very ill, William decided that the responsibility of a household with a long-term invalid in it was more than he was prepared for, and he found someone else to marry." Dexter's face did something then. Not pity, she would have minded pity. It was something harder and truer than pity. "He made the wrong choice," he said. "He was afraid," Georgia said. "I understand it, even if I cannot quite forgive it." "Some fears are not forgivable," Dexter said. She looked at him. "Like the fear that made you write that letter telling me not to come." He held her gaze. "Like that one," he said. "Exactly like that one, and I have not forgiven myself for it either, since you are apparently determined to be honest about everything." "I am," she said. "It seems more efficient." "It does," he said. And then carefully, deliberately, the way he did everything, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was not dramatic. It was not a grand gesture. It was just his hand on hers in the dark kitchen, and it said something that neither of them had said out loud yet. And she turned her hand over under his, and they sat like that for a while. And outside the wind was blowing, and somewhere a coyote was calling across the flat, dark Texas night. In November, the Callaway situation came to a head. Georgia had written, at Dexter's request, to his attorney in Amarillo, a man named Chester Falk, laying out in clear, organized terms the case for a handwriting expert, and including a summary of the legal precedents she had found in the legal journal her father had subscribed to, several issues of which she had brought with her in her travel bag, because she always traveled with reading material. Chester Falk wrote back to say that George's letter was the most useful thing he had received in this case so far, and that he had already engaged a handwriting expert named Dr. Philip Soames of Dallas, who had worked on several document fraud cases in the state, and that Dr. Soames was prepared to examine the Callaway note and compare it against the 3 known samples of Carter Abbott's signature that Chester had located. But before Dr. Soames could make his examination, Burke Callaway moved. Callaway was not a man who liked to wait for legal processes. He was a large, self-made man of 50 who had come to the Texas Panhandle in the 1860s with ambition and a flexible relationship with the law, and he had built his spread through a combination of genuine hard work and more than a few arrangements that did not bear close examination. He had been patient with the Abbott situation for 2 years because patience had generally served him well, but the news that Dexter Abbott's new woman had written to an attorney about a handwriting expert apparently motivated him to try a more direct approach. On a Tuesday morning in mid-November, Harlan Briggs and 2 other men came to the ranch again, but this time they did not stop at the gate. They rode through and came to the house, and when Tom Reardon intercepted them at the barn, Briggs told him with the flat, unconcerned ease of a man who carries 2 revolvers and expects them to do the persuading, that Callaway was formally demanding payment within 30 days or he would file his claim in the Amarillo District Court. Tom came to tell Dexter. Georgia was there. The 3 of them stood in the kitchen with this information. 30 days, Dexter said. Chester needs time for the handwriting examination, Georgia said. How much time does he need? He said 2 weeks for Dr. Soames to make the examination and prepare a report. Then we need to file a countermotion with the court before Callaway can file his claim. If we file first, we control the timeline. She looked at Dexter. Can Chester do that? I don't know. Write to him today, right now. I will draft the letter. Dexter looked at her with that direct, open look. You know, he said, for a woman who came out here as a practical housekeeper, you are considerably more than that. I have noticed that myself, she said. Is that a problem? No, he said, and she heard, underneath the simple word, something that was not simple at all. It is very much not a problem. She drafted the letter to Chester Falk that afternoon. Dexter read it, made 2 minor changes, signed it, and had Tom ride to Amarillo with it personally to save the time of the mail. Chester filed a motion with the court 2 days later, claiming fraud in the Callaway debt note and requesting a stay of any proceedings until the handwriting examination was complete. The judge, a man named Whitmore who was known in the territory as more honest than most, which was not a very high bar but was something, granted the stay for 45 days. They had time. Not a great deal of it, but enough. December came, and with it the first real snow of the year, and the ranch pulled inward the way ranches do in winter, becoming its own small world. Georgia had been there for 6 weeks, and the house felt different, not just because of the practical improvements she had made, which were significant, but because of something less tangible that she noticed in the way the boys moved through it. Less carefully, less as if they were waiting for the next loss. Caleb had started laughing again, a real laugh, not the guarded kind. Miles had always been cheerful, but his cheerfulness now had a more settled quality, less like bravado and more like genuine ease. One evening, Caleb asked if Georgia would read to them before bed. She looked at the bookshelf and selected David Copperfield, which she had always loved, and she sat by the fire with both boys close and Dexter in the big chair across the room, pretending to read accounts but not turning any pages. And she read until Miles fell asleep leaning against her arm and Caleb's eyes were heavy. And when she looked up, Dexter was watching her with an expression that he had forgotten to guard, and she felt the full force of it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. He carried Miles upstairs. She walked Caleb up. They met in the hallway, and the house was very quiet, and the snow was coming down outside the window at the end of the hall, soft and steady. Georgia, he said. She waited. I need to tell you something, and I want to tell it to you directly because I think you are owed that. All right, she said. I am in love with you. He said it the same way he did everything important, quietly, without decoration, looking directly at her. I have been trying not to be since about the second letter you sent me, and I have failed completely, and I think you should know that." She stood in the dim hallway with snow light coming through the window and felt everything she had been carrying 12 years of endurance, the long, careful management of not letting things matter set itself down, all at once. Like a bag put on the ground after a very long journey. "I love you too," she said. "I think I knew it before I arrived, which was part of why I came even after the letter." He moved to her in the hallway, carefully, giving her time to change her mind. And she did not change her mind. And when he took her face in his hands and kissed her, it was the most honest thing that had happened to her in longer than she could remember, not theatrical, not desperate, just true, like a sentence that finally arrives at its proper end after too many long clauses. They stood in the hallway for a while after, his forehead against hers, the snow coming down outside in the quiet dark. "What are we going to do about this?" he said. The practical question, she said, "is whether you intend to ask me properly." "I intend to ask you properly," he said. "When the Calloway situation is resolved, I do not want to ask you while there is a cloud over this place. I want it to be clear." "That is very like you," she said. "Is it a problem?" "No," she said, and she meant it the same way he had meant it. "Dr. Philip Soames arrived in Amarillo on the 14th of December and examined the Calloway note alongside 3 authenticated samples of Carter Abbott's signature, a letter written to his attorney in 1875, a deed of sale for cattle in 1877, and a promissory note to a legitimate creditor that had been paid and released in 1879. Dr. Soames was a precise, methodical man who had spent 20 years studying questioned documents, and he spent 4 days on his examination. His report, delivered on the 18th of December, was definitive. The signature on the Calloway note was not Carter Abbott's signature. The pressure patterns were wrong. The letter formation of the initial D was inconsistent with all 3 authenticated samples, and the ink composition appeared to be of a newer vintage than the date on the document. Dr. Soames was prepared to testify to all of this under oath. Chester Falk sent the report by express mail and followed it himself on the next stage to Canyon City, the nearest town of any size to the Abbott Ranch. He arrived on Christmas Eve. He also brought with him something else, a piece of information that Georgia had not expected, but that made everything make a kind of grim, clarifying sense. In the process of investigating Calloway's business dealings for context, Chester had discovered that Burke Calloway had done the same thing twice before, presented forged debt notes against the estates of deceased men whose families were struggling, and collected on them before anyone could mount a proper challenge. In one case, the family had simply not had the resources to fight. In the other, the husband had agreed to a settlement rather than face the costs of a legal battle. "He has done this at least 3 times, Chester said. He was a small, neat man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of controlled outrage. "And this is the first time he has been caught, because this is the first time someone has had the legal knowledge to know what to ask for." He looked at Georgia when he said this. Dexter was looking at her too. "The question," Chester continued, "is how far you want to take this. You can have the claim dismissed. The judge will do that on the basis of Dr. Soames's report alone. Or you can file a complaint against Calloway for fraud and forgery, which is a criminal matter, and present the evidence of the prior instances. That is a harder road, but it would prevent him from doing this to anyone else." Georgia looked at Dexter. Dexter looked at her. "We file the complaint," they said, at the same time in the same tone. Chester blinked behind his spectacles. Then he permitted himself a small, satisfied smile. "I was hoping you would say that," he said. Christmas in the Abbott household that year was a different thing than it had been the previous year, when grief and financial strain had made the celebration perfunctory and painful. Georgia made gingerbread with Miles, who had an enthusiastic approach to decoration that involved more sugar icing than was strictly necessary. Caleb and Dexter cut a cedar tree from the back of the property and stood it in the corner of the sitting room. Chester Falk, who had no family nearby, was invited to stay through the holiday, which he accepted with the careful gratitude of a man unaccustomed to being included. Tom Reardon and his wife, Martha, came for Christmas dinner. Martha Reardon was a square-built, cheerful woman who had clearly been waiting for some time for something good to happen at the Abbott Ranch, and she embraced Georgia upon meeting her with the warmth of a woman who had been hoping for an ally and was very pleased to have found one. After dinner, when the boys had gone to look at their gifts and Chester and Tom were talking cattle prices and Dexter and Georgia were at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee, Martha leaned in close to Georgia and said quietly, "He has been a different man since you arrived. I want you to know that. Tom has noticed it too. He was holding himself together with pure stubbornness and not much else, and you have given him something to hold together for. That is not a small thing." Georgia thought about that for a while after. She thought about the letter she had answered, the practical advertisement, the not a romantic arrangement. She thought about hidden motives, not dark ones, but the ones we hide from ourselves, the ones that write letters more carefully than necessary and read them more than once. On the 28th of December, the district court in Amarillo issued a formal dismissal of Burke Calloway's debt claim against the Abbott Ranch, based on the evidence of document fraud presented by Dr. Soames. On the same day, Chester Falk filed a criminal complaint against Calloway for fraud, forgery, and extortion, naming both the Abbott case and the 2 prior instances he had documented. Calloway's attorney attempted to have the criminal complaint dismissed on procedural grounds and failed. Calloway himself, faced with the accumulation of evidence, made the calculation that a man of his age and resources makes when the legal ground shifts underneath him, and in early February, he entered into a negotiated resolution with the district attorney's office. He did not go to prison. The law in 1884 Texas was not always just, and Calloway had resources enough to negotiate. But he paid significant fines. The judgment was entered against him in the public record, and he left the Panhandle region the following spring, and the families he had targeted in the earlier cases received formal acknowledgement of the injustice done to them, even if the money they had lost was not fully recovered. It was not complete justice, but it was more than they had had, and Georgia held on to that. On the 1st of January, 1884, Dexter Abbott found Georgia standing at the kitchen window watching the first light come up over the flat Texas land, turning everything pale gold and enormous, and the Calloway situation was resolved and the cloud he had spoken of was lifting, and he was very clear about what he meant to do. He stood beside her at the window for a moment and looked at the light. Then he turned to her. "Georgia Ellsworth," he said. He was holding something, a small garnet ring that had been his grandmother's, dark red as a winter berry, which he had retrieved from the box he kept in the top of the wardrobe where he kept things that mattered. "I meant to do this more formally. I had a whole speech planned, but I have been standing here watching you watch the sun come up and I find I cannot wait any longer." She turned from the window to look at him. "I am asking you to marry me," he said, "not because of a practical arrangement, not because the house needs managing or the boys need a mother, though they do and you are extraordinary at both. I am asking you because I love you and because you came to me anyway when I told you not to come, and because you taught me that the things that frighten us most are usually the things most worth having. I am asking you to be my wife and to build something here with me that is ours." Georgia Ellsworth looked at the garnet ring and at the man holding it and at the pale gold light flooding the Texas morning, and she thought, This is what I came 600 miles for, not the practical arrangement, this." "Yes," she said, "absolutely and without reservation, yes." He put the ring on her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. Then he put his arms around her and held her in the kitchen in the early morning light, and she put her face against his shoulder and felt the particular and profound relief of having arrived, after a very long journey, exactly where you are supposed to be. The boys found out at breakfast. Caleb received the news with a gravity appropriate to a moment of genuine importance, and then his face broke open into a smile so wide and so completely unguarded that Georgia had to look away for a moment to gather herself. Miles immediately demanded to know when the wedding would be and whether there would be cake and could he have a role in the proceedings. And Dexter told him that all of these things would be arranged, and yes, there would certainly be cake. "Can Georgia teach me to read better before the wedding?" Miles asked, "So I can read the parts in the ceremony." "I will teach you everything you want to know," Georgia promised him. They were married on the 14th of February, 1884, which Miles had insisted upon because he had learned about Valentine's Day from a book and felt strongly that the date was appropriate. Reverend Hollis performed the ceremony in the small white church in Canyon City, and Tom and Martha Reardon stood as witnesses, and Chester Falk came down from Amarillo because he felt he had earned the right to see the happy ending of the case that had given him the most satisfaction of his career. Caleb stood beside his father in a suit that had been let out at the shoulders because he had grown, and he held the rings on a small cushion with all the ceremony of a boy who understood the weight of the occasion. Miles sat in the front pew between Martha Reardon and a neighbor woman named Clara Britton and tried very hard to contain his excitement with imperfect success. And when Reverend Hollis said the part about "Do you, Dexter James Abbott, take this woman?" Miles said yes very quietly under his breath as if to help things along. Georgia wore the blue dress she had made from fabric she and Martha had selected together at the dry goods store, a practical blue, not a festive blue, because Georgia was still Georgia, and practicality did not leave her even on her wedding day. But it was a particular shade of blue that happened to do remarkable things for her dark eyes and her dark hair, and the way she carried herself, which was upright and clear and completely herself. When Dexter said "I do," his voice was steady and his eyes did not leave her face. When Georgia said "I do," she meant it with her whole entire self. He kissed her in the little church with the winter light coming through the windows, and it tasted like yes. It tasted like everything she had decided to stop being afraid of. After the ceremony, the reception was held at the ranch. Martha and Clara had organized it with a thoroughness that left no detail unaddressed, and the table was laden with food, and there was indeed cake, a very good one, and the afternoon was cold and bright and full of the particular pleasure of a small community celebrating something genuinely good. Tom pulled Dexter aside at one point and told him, with the blunt affection of a man who has worked beside another man for many years, that he was glad, and that Georgia was exactly what was needed, and that he hoped Dexter knew what he had. Dexter told him that he knew exactly what he had and intended to spend the rest of his life being worthy of it. Tom told him that was the right answer and went back to his wife. The following years were not without difficulty. No years on a cattle ranch in the Texas Panhandle were without difficulty. There were dry years and hard winters and cattle losses, and the ongoing complexity of raising boys who were growing into men. Caleb at 14 was serious and purposeful and increasingly interested in the law, which he had observed with great attention during the Callaway proceedings, and he told Georgia one afternoon that he intended to study law, and Georgia told him that she thought that was exactly right. She wrote to Chester Falk, who wrote back with a list of books Caleb should read, and this began a correspondence between Caleb Abbott and Chester Falk that would eventually, years later, result in Caleb reading law in Chester's Amarillo office. Miles grew into a boy of magnificent enthusiasms and considerable charm, who loved the land the way some people love a person, as a specific, irreplaceable thing, not as a general category. He decided early that ranching was his life's work, and he approached it with the same methodical passion he had always brought to his rock collection and his weather observations. In the autumn of 1884, Georgia found herself sitting at the kitchen table early one morning, before Dexter was up, working through an arithmetic that was both practical and momentous. She had already known for 3 weeks though she had wanted to be certain, and now she was certain. And when Dexter came downstairs, she was still at the table with her cup of coffee and a private expression on her face. He stopped when he saw it. "What is it?" She looked up at him. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands in both of his, and his face was, she would remember his face in that moment for the rest of her life. Not just happy, though it was that. It was the face of a man who has decided to love something fully and has been rewarded for that decision, and who understands in his bones what a gift that is. "A baby," he said. "In the spring," she said. "April, I think." He kissed her hands. He held them. He sat down beside her at the table, and they sat close together in the early morning quiet of the kitchen they had shared for a year now, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And outside, the flat Texas morning was beginning to go pale gold the way it always did. The boys received the news at dinner that evening. Caleb went still and serious, and said that he thought it was very good news, and asked several careful and thoughtful questions about practical arrangements. Miles immediately proposed names, including several that were wildly impractical, and insisted on being given a specific responsibility in relation to the new baby when it arrived, and was told he could be in charge of entertaining it, which he considered an appropriate allocation of his gifts. The baby arrived on the 5th of April, 1885, in the particular chaos of first births, which Georgia managed with an endurance and pragmatism that impressed even the experienced midwife, Clara Britton's older sister Ruth, who had delivered a great many babies in this territory. Dexter was in the kitchen the entire time, completely unable to sit still, periodically boiling water because it gave him something to do with his hands. And when Ruth came to tell him he had a son, he stood in the kitchen for a full 10 seconds, simply breathing before he went to see Georgia. She was exhausted and her hair was everywhere, and she was holding the baby with the instinctive, careful authority of a woman who has managed complicated things all her life. And she looked up when Dexter came in and she said, "He is healthy. Ruth says he is perfectly healthy." Dexter sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son's dark hair, bright eyes already scanning the world with a suspicious alertness, approximately the size of a useful volume of Dickens, and felt something expand in his chest that was almost too large to contain. "What shall we call him?" Georgia said. They had discussed names. They had not agreed on any of them. "Carter," Dexter said. He said it carefully, testing it. "For my father, not because my father was a perfect man. He was not. But because this land was his once, and now it is ours, and the continuity seems right." Georgia considered this. "Carter Abbott," she said. "Yes, that is right." Carter Abbott turned out to be an enormously opinionated baby who had very specific requirements about everything and communicated them without hesitation. Miles was delighted by him in the way only a 12-year-old boy with a gift for entertainment can be delighted, not with the solemn reverence of a new sibling, but with a genuine, engaged pleasure that made him an excellent companion for an infant who wanted stimulation and responsiveness. Caleb held his baby brother with the careful gravity of a boy who takes all responsibilities seriously, and who sat for long, quiet minutes reading to the baby from books that were far beyond the baby's comprehension, on the theory that you could not start reading to a person too early. The ranch in those years settled into a life that was genuinely good. Not easy. The Texas Panhandle in the 1880s did not offer easy, but good in the deep, rooted way that things are good when they are built on truth and sustained by real feeling. Georgia ran the household with the same clear competence she brought to everything, but it was not just management anymore. It was a life she had built, and that fit her completely. She kept the accounts. She corresponded with Chester Falk about legal matters, which had become a genuine intellectual partnership. Chester had told her more than once that she would have been a formidable attorney. She read to the children every evening. She argued with Dexter about books and ranch decisions, and occasionally about the proper way to organize the storeroom. And these arguments were the particular pleasure of two people who are genuinely matched and who enjoy being matched. Dexter, for his part, was a man transformed by the simple and revolutionary act of being loved without reservation. Not transformed into a different person. He was still quiet, still careful, still given to working through things alone in the small hours, and needing to be coaxed out of his own head, but transformed in the sense that the thing he had been holding closed for 2 years was open again, and everything that came through that opening, love, laughter, the domestic warmth of a full house, the particular pleasure of his wife reading Shakespeare by firelight, came through fully, without the numbing protection of detachment. He told Georgia once on a summer evening when Carter was asleep and the older boys were out and they were sitting on the porch in the last of the long summer light, that he thought about the letter he had sent telling her not to come and felt a terror at how close he had come to not having this. "You would not have sent it, ultimately," Georgia said. "I did send it," he said. "You sent it," she agreed. "But you would not have meant it. You were reading my letters more than once. You would have written again." He considered this. "Maybe," he said, "but you did not wait to find out." "No," she said, "I did not. I am not a woman who waits for things to be certain before she acts. Certainty is a luxury, and I have always found action more useful." He took her hand on the porch railing. "I am very glad you are not that kind of woman." "I know," she said. In 1887, they had a daughter. They named her Margaret Rose Abbott, with George's full approval, because Margaret had been loved here and had built something here, and the name was not a shadow but an honoring. Maggie Rose, as she became almost immediately, was a small, fierce person with her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular expression of cool, interested assessment, that she turned on the world from her first coherent moments. And she had all 3 of her older brothers absolutely wrapped around her smallest finger from approximately her first week of life. Carter, who was 2.5, regarded Maggie with the suspicious fascination of a person who has previously been the smallest and is now suddenly not. He would sit beside her cradle and stare at her with an expression of deep internal deliberation. And then, one afternoon, he put his hand very gently on top of her head in a gesture that said, unmistakably, "Mine," and after that he was her most devoted protector. Miles, at 16, was so enchanted by his baby sister that Tom Reardon observed, with the dry humor he reserved for things he found genuinely delightful, that the boy would make an excellent father someday as long as someone kept him from spoiling the child completely. Caleb was 18 and had already begun his correspondence with Chester Falk about legal study, and he held Maggie with the careful, reverent attention of a boy who has been holding things carefully all his life and knows, now, that this is a quality and not just a coping mechanism. Dexter looked at his family, all of his family, this improbable complete family that had come from grief and a handwritten card on a post office wall and a woman who had not waited for certainty, and felt something he had not expected to feel again. Not just contentment, not just gratitude, something richer and more specific than either of those things. He felt at home in his own life. After years of managing it from a careful distance, of enduring it rather than living it, he was at home in it. He told Georgia this one evening in the kitchen after the children were in bed, in the kitchen where they had always told each other the truest things. She was at the table with a book and a cup of tea, and she looked up when he said it. "I feel that too," she said. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked. "Coming to Texas, answering that ridiculous advertisement." She pretended to consider this. "The stagecoach from Amarillo was very uncomfortable," she said. "I regret that." He sat down across from her. "Georgia." "No," she said, dropping the pretense entirely, because she was always willing to drop pretense when he needed her to be real. "Not a single moment of it. Not even the stagecoach." He reached across the table, the same way he had in the beginning, in the dark kitchen before anything was decided, and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over under his, the same way she had then. Some things you establish early and then they just remain true. The following years brought Caleb to Amarillo and Chester Falk's law office, and then to a formal legal education, and ultimately to a practice of his own that he built with the same careful seriousness he had always brought to everything. He married at 25, a woman named Harriet Soames. Yes, the daughter of the very Dr. Philip Soames who had examined the Callaway note, which was either fate or a very satisfying coincidence, and brought her home to the ranch for the first Christmas, and Georgia liked her immediately because Harriet had the same clear-eyed, direct quality that Georgia recognized as the mark of a woman who says what she means. Miles stayed on the land, as he had always intended. He grew into a remarkable cattleman, with an intuitive sense for the work that Tom Reardon, in his retirement years, said was the best natural talent he had encountered. He married at 22, a Canyon City girl named Alois Britt, Clara Britton's daughter, who was cheerful and sensible and adored Miles with a patience appropriate to his enthusiasms, and she fit into the ranch household with the ease of someone who has been designed for exactly this. Carter grew up between books and cattle and his sister Maggie, and became a person of many interests and strong opinions and excellent humor, who managed to combine his parents' qualities in a way that regularly startled both of them. At 17, he was reading law alongside his brother's old correspondence materials, and Georgia was teaching him Latin from a book she had sent away from an Austin bookshop. Maggie Rose Abbott grew into a small, fierce, determined person who had decided at approximately age 6 that the world was a very interesting place that she intended to engage with at full capacity. She rode before she could walk steadily. She argued before she was supposed to know how. She read everything in the house, all of Shakespeare, all of the Dickens, the legal journals, the accounts ledger, the letters Georgia kept in a box on the bedroom shelf, with the focused intensity of a child for whom books were not recreation but sustenance. She was 12 when she found in the box the original advertisement that had started all of it. The small, handwritten card, which Georgia had kept without quite admitting to herself why. Widower in the Texas Panhandle seeks a steady, sensible woman to help with a household and 2 boys aged 9 and 11. Not a romantic arrangement. Practical. Respond if serious. Maggie brought it to Georgia at the kitchen table and held it up with the expression of a girl who has discovered something very interesting. "Is this what brought you here?" she said. "That is the advertisement your father placed," Georgia said. "Yes." Maggie read it again. "Not a romantic arrangement," she read aloud, and looked at Georgia with an expression of profound skepticism that was both entirely her own and entirely her mother's. "That does not appear to have been accurate." Georgia laughed, a real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest. "No," she said, "it was not." "Did he know," Maggie asked, "when he wrote it, that it would be?" Georgia thought about this honestly. "I think he knew that he wanted something and was frightened of it," she said, "and so he described the practical part and left out the part that frightened him." Maggie considered this with the intensity she brought to all considerations. "And you came anyway." "I came anyway, because you knew, because I hoped," Georgia said, "and I decided that hope was worth the journey." Maggie put the card down on the table. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am glad you came." "I know," Georgia said. "So am I, and Caleb and Miles were glad too," Maggie said. "Papa told me. He told me that they held the door open for you, and it was the first time they had done that for anyone, and he knew then that everything was different." "Your father told you that?" "He tells me a lot of things," Maggie said, with the serene confidence of a daughter who has a particular relationship with her father. "He says I should understand where I come from. So I do." Georgia looked at her daughter, this improbable, completely specific person who would not exist if a card had not been pinned on a post office wall in Virginia, if 2 boys had not held a door open, if a man who was frightened of mattering had decided to matter anyway. "Your father is right," Georgia said. "You should understand where you come from." Maggie picked up the card again, turned it over in her hands, set it down. "Practical," she said with that skeptical expression. "He really wrote that. He really wrote that. And then he put the garnet ring on your finger. On New Year's Day, Georgia said, in the kitchen, before the sun was fully up. Maggie smiled a smile that was all her own, wide and certain, and full of the particular pleasure of a person who finds the world richly ironic and entirely lovable. I think, she said, that Dexter Abbott was not a very accurate advertiser. No, Georgia agreed. He was not, but he was very good at everything else. The evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, Dexter and Georgia sat on the porch in the February cold. They had decided that sitting outside on a cold evening was exactly what they intended to do, and no one who knew them was surprised by this decision. And the ranch stretched out around them in the winter dark. The cattle settled, the horses quiet in the barn, the house behind them warm with lamplight and the sounds of children. They had a bottle of wine that Chester Falk had sent from Amarillo as a gift, and 2 glasses, and a wool blanket across their knees. 10 years, Dexter said. 10 years, Georgia agreed. You came into this house with $14 and a box of china and a legal journal that would eventually ruin Burke Calloway's scheme. The china is still in the cabinet, Georgia said. The $14 did not last long. No, he said, but everything else lasted. He looked at her in the dark in the way he had always looked at her, with that direct, full attention that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him, and that had never diminished. Everything else lasted very well. She leaned into him under the blanket. He put his arm around her. The Texas night was clear and cold and enormous above them, all stars, the particular vastness of the Panhandle sky that had startled her when she first arrived and that she now loved with a specificity and depth that is the mark of a place that has become yours. I want to tell you something, he said. Tell me. I have been thinking about the letter, the one I wrote telling you not to come. You have thought about it a great many times, she said gently. You are allowed to stop. I know, he said. What I want to tell you is that I think I wrote it because I knew. I think some part of me knew before you arrived that you were going to change everything, and I was frightened enough to try to stop it. And then the boys held that door open and I understood that you were going to change everything no matter what I did because it was already happening and the only question was whether I was going to be a coward or not. Georgia was quiet, listening. And I almost was, he said. A coward. I very nearly succeeded at it. And when I think about that, don't, she said softly. You did not, and the boys held the door open, and here we are. He pressed his lips to her hair. Here we are, he said. Here we are. A ranch in the Texas Panhandle in 1894, solid and solvent and genuinely thriving, with a herd that Tom Reardon had called the finest in the county before his retirement, and that Miles was building into something that might one day be the finest in the state. 2 older boys who were men now, making their ways in the world with the particular combination of practicality and feeling that their parents had modeled for them. 2 younger children growing into people of enormous promise. A house full of books and the smell of good cooking, and the sound of argument and laughter, and the occasional raised voice that came from genuine engagement with genuine disagreement, and was always followed by genuine reconciliation. A garnet ring on Georgia Ellsworth Abbott's finger, dark red as a winter berry, that had not left her hand in 10 years. A man who had written not a romantic arrangement in an advertisement and who had been completely, gloriously wrong. 2 boys, grown now, who had held a door open one October afternoon in 1883 for a woman they did not know, because they knew somehow, the way children know things, with a deep and wordless certainty, that she was the person who was supposed to walk through it. Inside the warm house, Miles was telling Caleb something that involved considerable gesturing, and Caleb was receiving it with the expression of patient attention he always gave his younger brother. And Carter was reading at the kitchen table with one of the legal journals, and Maggie was curled in the big chair by the fire with a book held up to the light, and the advertisement card was back in the box on the bedroom shelf where Georgia kept things that mattered. And the embroidery above the fireplace still said home is where the heart is in Margaret's green and gold thread, which was true in the ordinary sense, but which was also true in the deeper sense that nobody can fully explain, the sense in which home is not a place at all, but a condition of being known and staying known and choosing, every day, the enormous and practical and secretly romantic act of remaining. Georgia Ellsworth had come 600 miles for practical. She had found, instead, everything, and she had the very good sense to keep it.